Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we'll be using our JHipster full stack application to back an iOS mobile app's data. This is one of the main reasons we've been building a full stack application. Most mobile apps need some kind of shared data store that lives on the internet that the app can use. This may be data directly related to the user or more generic like in our case. So if you remember, our web application will store and display multiple courses and lessons on multiple disciplines that we talk about on the Electronic Armory, such as 3D, game development, electronics, and of course, mobile and web application development. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to tap into that data and pull it into a mobile app. In the future, we'll build that into a fully featured mobile app. For now, we'll keep it simple. Now, I already have a JHipster application up and running, so if you haven't seen that yet, I'll provide those links. And you can check out how to build a microservice application using JHipster. So if you remember, this is our application. It's just very bare bones at the moment, but let's go ahead and log into our admin account. Okay, once we log in as the admin, we have a couple of administration menu items here, namely the API. So let's take a look at the application's APIs and investigate how those APIs work with our application. So we'll be using these APIs in order to communicate from our mobile app to our backend application. So we're just going to start at the top, and in our case, the discipline is at the top. So if you click on Discipline Resource, you'll get a list of APIs that are available for that particular resource. Now, if you remember, disciplines is actually an entity within our application. It has its own database table, it has its own API endpoints, and a couple of other things like that that we can directly access. So what we're interested in this particular case is to click on the API disciplines. That is a get without the ID, and this will get all disciplines. Okay, so if we scroll down so you can see this, this is going to be a REST case where the response class is going to return 200 and OK, and then the data that it's going to return looks something similar to this, and you can see that this is actually populated with some data that we have in our previous tutorials. Okay, and some other response message is a 401 for unauthorized. Okay, so what we want to do is actually try it out. So let's click try it out and scroll down a little bit more so we can see what try it out reveals. And it'll give you an example curl request. Now this is super useful if you've ever dealt with REST endpoints before, because what it'll actually do is tell you exactly what needs to go in the header information. So namely that in the header, you have to have a key value pair, the key being accept, and the value in this case being application JSON. This is just telling the server that you are going to accept application.json as a request, as a response type. The next header key value pair that we're going to add is authorization bearer, and then this really long string, which we'll talk about here in a little while. Okay, and then finally we have the URL itself that we are going to hit. That's also displayed here in the request URL, but in our curl request, which if you're not familiar with curl, it's just what you would enter in on the command line using some kind of Unix system. Next, we have the response body, what this is going to actually return. And so in our case, we just have two examples. One is a mobile development discipline. The ID on that is 1 in case you want a unique identifier. The next is the discipline description, and then any programs that we have associated with it. We haven't actually added these yet, but if you did, they would return as an array. So for our example, our iOS application that we're going to build today, we're just going to get this list, obviously in an array, and then we're going to go through each one of these and just print them out to the screen. In future videos, we're going to be building a full-featured application where we'll display this information in a UI table view, and then of course we'll have a Android counterpart to it as well. Next, the 200 response code is what we're going to expect from the response from the server. So it's always a good practice to check that response code to see if it is 200, and if it's something else, to handle that error or that message accordingly. Finally, we have the response headers. Now this is the headers that were returned. So in our curl request, these are the headers that we're sending in our request, and then the response has its own headers, and you can take a look at what those are, namely that this is going to be a JSON request because obviously this code up here is in JSON. And there's a couple other fields in here such as today's date and some other things like no caching and a bunch of other things that you may or may not be familiar with. Okay, so let's take a look and see how we can use Swagger to integrate this within our iOS application. All right, so here I have just a default single view iOS application template that I've just created, and there's nothing special about this. You can have almost any type of starting point for iOS. And so what we're going to do is we're first going to import the Alamofire library. And what this is going to allow us to do is very easily make REST calls to our server with very little code. Now you can use the built-in NSURL connection and those types of built-in APIs that Apple produces, but I find Alamofire is just a little bit more friendly to use and handles a lot of the common boilerplate code that you might have to write yourself otherwise. So to install Alamofire, you can simply just drag this into the root directory of your application. And so for this one, I've named it just Armory, and I already have this open here in Xcode. Now I have a previous video where I built out an entire application using a static JSON file with Core Data, which is the embedded database system that Apple uses on both iOS and Mac, as well as JSON parsing and a little bit of other stuff like that. So if you're interested in continuing this application further, look up the video on how to build an iOS application from scratch, and I do plan on doing one for Android as well. So to install Alamofire, we need to double click on this and open it up, and then drag its own Xcode project into our project itself. So I'm just gonna click and drag this in and put it almost anywhere. I usually like to kind of stick these at the top. And then scroll down to the bottom where we have the linked frameworks and libraries, and click on this little plus way at the bottom of the screen, and then it'll drop down a list of frameworks that we can add to our project. And so the final step here is to simply click on the iOS version of Alamofire. Make sure you don't click on any of the other ones because it will not work. All right, so once we have our Alamofire Xcode project imported into our file list here, and also make sure that we have the Alamofire framework, we can now begin to use Alamofire. But before we do that, I want to make sure that our application can use resources over HTTP rather than HTTPS, because on our local host, JHipster is running under HTTP. Now, by default, Apple does not allow this, but it does allow us to make exceptions in our application. So if you go into the info.plist, you'll see a bunch of different options for our application. So under one of these items, hit a plus button to add another item, and this one is called App Transport Security. Okay, and this is the one that we want here, so you can type as much as you need to in order to get this setting to come up. Hit enter, and this is going to be an NS dictionary, or if you come from the Java side, this is the equivalent of a hash. Now, there's nothing under this, so if you hit this disclosure arrow, there's nothing under it. So we're going to add a plus on here, which will add another object underneath it, and this will say allow arbitrary loads. This is going to give us the ability to load basically arbitrary URLs, meaning HTTP. Now we can make exceptions for certain domains by selecting this and then putting the domains in. But what we're going to do is just have this selected here, double click on this guy, and either just type in yes, or you can go all the way to this little selection and click on yes. So that's going to be a Boolean value that allows us to load arbitrary URLs. Okay, so go ahead and save that. Go back to our view controller, and I'm going to just go ahead and build this. Not hitting the play button, you can hit Command B, or you can just go up to Product, Build. And what that's going to do in the meantime is it's going to actually compile Alamofire, and it's going to create that framework for us so that we can begin to use it. If you try to import the module before it's done compiling, you might get an error saying it doesn't know what it is. So just make sure you build the project before. So now we're going to import Alamofire, and it should come up in your autocomplete. And again, if it doesn't, just do a quick build by hitting Control B. Now that this module is added, what we're going to do in this tutorial is simply just load the resource for disciplines right here in our view did load. Now, if you're not familiar with iOS, view did load inside of our main view controller is going to be kind of our entry point for this particular view. Now it's the only view in our application, and so this is just going to be called first. We're going to load the resource, and then we're going to display it. And that's going to be it for this tutorial. And then, as I said at the beginning of this video, we're going to build out a full application. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Now, just to remind you really quickly, the endpoint that we're going to use is API/disciplines, and then we're going to expect the response to be something in the nature of this one right here, okay? So in order to do this, we actually have to authenticate first, because sometimes these endpoints are behind a user account. And in other words, we need to log in order to get this information. And so if we go up to account resource, we have a authenticate endpoint here. So this authenticate method, if I call it here in Swagger, it's actually going to use the current login credentials. I'm logged in as a admin, and if I logged out, well, we wouldn't be able to see Swagger. But if I go ahead and hit try it out, what it's going to do is it's actually going to pass in the header information with authentication, bearer, and then this token that I already have received because I've logged in. Now what we're going to do instead is actually create the headers in order to generate this and then pass it to the authenticate message. And then in that callback that we get from the server after we authenticate, we are then going to download the disciplines using the generated token that this passes back. Okay, and so let's just go ahead and dive into it and you'll see what I mean by that. Okay, so like most Alamofire requests, we're going to start this out using the Alamofire.request. And we're going to use this longer version that you see here, not these more simplified versions, because we want to actually add in not just the URL that we're calling, and in this case API/authenticate, but also the HTTP method, and we're going to use a get with some parameters, and those parameters in our case is going to be the username, password, and then there's another one that I want to show you. The encoding is simply just going to be the JSON encoding and a couple headers for those parameters. And the headers are simply going to be that we're going to accept a application/JSON as a response. Okay, so let's go ahead and select that. Now it's going to ask for our URL, and we're simply just going to type in a string here, and that string is going to be http://localhost, because again, our application is running on localhost port 8080, so let me just actually copy that and paste it in. Oh, and I got the whole, let me undo that, highlight that, paste that back in, API/authenticate, and I'm going, just so I don't misspell it, I'm going to go back real quick and just highlight, well, okay, I'll just take the whole thing. It's probably not going to be the best there. But that ensures that I don't make any typos, because anytime I try to type this in manually, one time out of 10 I'll misspell it, and then it'll take me anywhere from 10 minutes to 20 minutes to track that down, and it's a little bit embarrassing when you realize that you just misspelled the URL, and that's why it's not working. Okay, so now we have this endpoint that we're going to request. So this method here is, you can just type in .get, and then the next parameter .get, and then control / will put you into the next placeholder here for parameters. Now we haven't created those yet, so let's go ahead and do that now. So let's go up a line of code, hit enter, give it a little bit of space, and these parameters we're going to say let, and I'm just going to call this parameters, and this is going to be of type parameters with a capital P, and this is simply going to be an array. And so as part of that array, we have a key value pair, and so the first value, the first key is going to not be unicorn, it's going to be username, and colon, and the value for that username in our case is going to be user, and that's just the generic built-in user that's created with this. Obviously you'd get this from a login screen, so you'd ask the user for the username and password, and then you would fill those values in here. So we're just hard coding it for simplicity's sake, but that's the proper way to do that. And then the next one is password colon, and then the password for this user is user. So I forgot to put in a comma there, and then another comma here. And then I also wanted to show you the feature that it'll tell the server basically to keep our user login and not destroy the authentication token that we're going to be using from here on out. And that authentication token, I'll show you what that is in a second. But for this one, it's not a string. Remember, this is always why I copy and paste, but this one is going to be remember me with a capital M, and set this to true. And that's all we have to do for the parameters. So it's just going to warn me that I haven't used it yet, and thank you because I'm not done yet. And actually we can hit Control / to jump to that first placeholder, and then simply paste that in, and then Control / again to go to the next one. And this one is going to be parameter encoding. And as I mentioned, the parameter encoding is just simply JSON encoding.default. Okay, and that's just going to, again, use the default JSON encoding. The headers are just going to simply be that I want to accept application JSON as a response to this request. So let's go down here and say and I'm just going to call this headers, and this is going to be of type headers, HTTP headers. And this is going to be equal to pretty much the same type. It's a key value pair dictionary here. So this is accept and application, make sure you spell it right, and then JSON. Okay, and if you're getting an error from your response of your server, it could be that this is incorrect, or that the application does not, for some reason, respond in JSON. Other values that I've seen in here that you could use is XML, but by default, the application will respond in JSON, just like the Swagger response here. Oh, those are the response headers, but let's get another one here. Something like this would be in JSON. Okay, so that's what we're expecting there. We're not using headers, I know, thank you. And then Control / to put your placeholder and paste that in. And now that we have that, what we can do is we can get a response JSON handler for the response that comes back from the server. Okay, and then what we're going to do, instead of getting the putting that in a handler, we're just going to write it in line here. And so begin curly brace, and then go back up here and just say response in. And what that's going to do, and I have no idea why those keep coming up, response is going to be your parameter that's passed in, and that parameter is going to hold the values of the response that the server gives us back, namely the authentication token using the username and password here. So let's just go ahead and print that out and see what that's going to look like. So let's create a new line here, say print, and then in parentheses, we're going to use that response that we're being passed in as a parameter. And we're simply just going to do results and then value. And this is going to return an any object. And so what this is going to complain about is the fact that I don't have a explicit any. This value could be null. Now I know everything's working, and in production you'd want to handle this and make sure that the response code is of type 200. But what I'm going to do for this one is I'm just going to say force unwrap here, and then that hopefully should just print out the authentication token. Now I'm going to put a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here, because what's going to happen is it's going to run through the code all the way here, and then it's going to make that request, and then it's going to skip over this response body, and then when the request comes back, it's going to execute this line of code. So let's just go ahead and do that. All right, so our simulator loaded up real quick. There was nothing in the interface, obviously, and then it's going to hit this line of code, and we're going to play through that, and then sometime in the future, it'll come back inside of this. And hopefully, if we look at our response, we can look at it and see what the actual value is. And I can see right away that this result is of type failure. And so actually this might give us an error. But let's look at the result real quick. Okay, and it's saying that the response serialization failed, but let's go ahead and print that out, see if it prints out. And it says that it unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. And so that's what I was talking about with handling this appropriately. So let's take a step back and kind of debug this a little bit. Now I know that the result is a failure, and that's not good in the first place, but it doesn't really tell us why. And so if you kind of look in some of these values here, you might be able to determine what went wrong I think I have an idea, and it's maybe something with Swagger. But if we go up here and go to the authenticate, is authenticated, it does say it's a get method, but we're actually passing a username and password, and by passing those in as parameters, we should actually make that as a post request. So let's go back to Xcode and let's change this from get to post. And let's try this out again. Command R to run this. We'll bring up our simulator again. Should just go to white, hit our breakpoint, and just to show you what this is doing, and put a breakpoint there. Now it jumps over there. I can just remove that. And then third breakpoint it's hitting is inside of our method. Okay, so sorry for the confusion, but that's we can now see that our result is a success. And now when we print this out to the screen by just stepping over this line of code, we can see that we have a dictionary. Actually, it starts here. A dictionary response as a key value pair. Okay, so ID token is our key, and then the value that we're going to be using for our authentication token is this. And so this is just a bunch of random characters here that's generated from our server. So no longer do we have to use our username and password. Instead, we're using this key. Now, if any of our responses come back, instead of success, come back as a 4.0 something, like a 4.01 or 4.02, I forget what the actual one is, for being unauthenticated, that means our application then has to re-authenticate the application. Now, that might mean that you log the user out and ask for their username and password again, or if you're storing that in the iOS keychain, that you just go ahead and resubmit the authentication in the background, get a new key, and then make that response again, which could take a little bit of time depending upon how much security you want. You may just have to log the user out and again ask for their username and password, and that way you're not storing the username and password on the device, which is kind of important if it's sensitive information. Otherwise, if it's just a little application, you can store this username and password. But again, up to you for that. Okay, so we're gonna copy this key here because instead of this, we want to store that token in a variable. Normally, you would do this in some kind of maybe singleton repository or service so that you can access this key from anywhere that you need to make an API call. So for this one, I'm going to create a new token, and this token is going to be for the response result, and then the value of that result. I'm not going to unwrap that. I'm actually going to typecast this as a dictionary. Okay, so it comes back as a dictionary as we print it out to the screen. And our dictionary is going to be of type string and then another string. So string, string. And so for that one, we're going to create this template here. And this is going to be string and then comma string. All right, and so that is going to allow us to typecast the value that we printed out here. Again, this dictionary with string, string, typecast that as a dictionary as string, string. So if this format is a little new to you, if you've never done iOS, I just wanted to explain that to you. Okay, so we have now our token, which Xcode's complaining that we're not using. I'm not done yet, thank you, Xcode. Okay, so that token represents the key value pair, but what I want to do is actually create another variable, and maybe I'm being a little bit too verbose, but I do want to show you what we're doing here and how to pull these values out of here properly. This is going to be of type string, and this is going to equal the token, and as a dictionary, we just grab that using the ID, and I'm not going to type that in, I'm just going to copy and paste it here. Again, just a good habit to get into that we're not doing that. But this value could be null, and so we're just going to unwrap that here, just handling our potential null values there. And again, you want to handle that appropriately, but this is just for simplicity. Next, we're going to want to then call the actual endpoint that we're interested in. Not that one. We're going to not authenticate, but let's see, this one here, API disciplines, and we're just going to copy and paste that here and go back to Xcode. And what I'm going to do is just put this in as a comment for the time being, and then under that I'm going to make another Alamofire request. Okay, and using the long format here. Now the URL is going to also be this guy here. I'm just going to copy and paste that. Normally you'd put that into a constant, right? And so that we don't have to continuously type this in, and maybe if we ever change it from localhost to an actual web server, which we'll do in a future video, we will be able to just change it in one place. Okay, and so for this method, it is going to be a .get. I'm sure about that this time. And if you notice, we are actually nesting this request inside of this request. So we're chaining these requests. And again, this is just for example, but normally what you do is you'd authenticate early, and then later in your code, you might execute this using the value stored somewhere in your application. But again, we're just going to chain these calls so that it just calls one after the other. We have the value stored locally, and then we can use this authentication token to create some new headers. So we'll do that in 2 seconds, but the next parameter that we're going to be putting in here is the parameters. And so we've already created an object called parameters up here. We are no longer going to use that username and password. We're going to use this authentication token, which again is namely this guy. And so, okay, so the next parameter that we're going to put in is parameters. Now there are no parameters in this case because we are no longer going to use the username and password for these parameters here. We're going to solely use this authentication token that is now stored in this variable here. So for parameters, you can simply type in nil to just ignore that. And then for the encoding, same result is JSON encoding and then .default. Okay, so for headers now, we do need to create a variable for the headers here. So let's call it, oh, and I just noticed that I did not paste that in properly for some reason. So let's switch back to our, and just make sure we're explicitly perfect. Okay, yeah, so that's make sure that is correct. And again, that would give us an error if we tried that. And let's see. Okay, let's just double check we have everything. Perfect. Okay, so we have new headers here, and these are going to be the discipline headers. So I'm just going to type in discipline headers, and this is going to be of type HTTP headers again. And for the headers for this one, we can go back to our Swagger call to give us some reference of what that needs to look like. So if you go try it out, it'll tell you what the header information here is by this this flag for this command. Now it's going to have accept application JSON, which we can put in there. And then for the next header, we can put in authentication :bearer space, and then our authentication token that we have for the admin. Now the admin one is going to look a little bit different than the user, so we're not going to copy this. And then finally, this is the full URL that we're going to be creating this from, and I could have just copied and pasted that in from there. So if we go back to this part, what this is authentication bearer, and then everything after that is our authentication token. So I'm just going to copy this, switch back to Xcode, and as our header, this is a dictionary, so we're going to start this off with a key value pair, and the key being all, actually I already have that pasted in here, or I already have that in my clipboard, so I'm going to paste that in there. That's the key, and then the value is going to be bearer space, and then I'm going to append our new authorization token. Okay, and so this authorization bearer space and then our authorization token, excuse me, is going to satisfy the Swagger request here, and then again it's going to post in the authentication token that's here. Okay, so now that becomes part of our headers for the request. And for this one, we're going to get our JSON response back from this. And I believe Alamofire, if you do a response JSON, will automatically add in the accept header application JSON here. I'm pretty sure it'll automatically do that because I don't need to explicitly put in an accept. Like, for example, you would do accept colon and then application JSON, right? So we don't have to do that in this case because Alamofire takes care of that for us. And then in this, this is going to be the start of our handler, and then the response is going to get passed in as a parameter, and then using the in keyword, in keyword, hit space, enter, create a new line, and then inside of this, I'm just going to simply type out, or print out, excuse me, the response dot result, and then print out the response result value. And I'm going to put a breakpoint in there, and I can actually remove this initial breakpoint. Okay, and let's just see if this works first. So I'm going to just hit the play button or Command R, switch over to our simulator. All right, so we got a quick error here, and that is because I forgot to end the extra curly brace here. No big deal. And then let's try that again. Okay, perfect. So now we have a token. We are going to grab that token out of the dictionary and put that in the authorization token. If we hover over that, that is just the value as a string of our token. And so we got rid of this ID token because we just need this guy here. And then we're going to create the headers for that, and you can look and see what the headers look like. One key value pair, excellent, one value, and then the key authorization, bear our key. So that looks almost exactly like our Swagger request that we need to do here. And this is one example why Swagger will give you this curl request, because you can actually execute this on command line in Unix. Okay, so that looks all good, and I'm just going to go ahead and play over this, and then we'll get a response back from the server. And if we look at the response real quick, we can see instantly it is a success, and play over that. And I printed out the response result. And so what you could do is do a quick check to make sure that response is of type success. And then finally, the value of that result is going to give us the disciplines that we have stored in our system. And so what we have here, the discipline name is new one here that I added just as a test, mobile development as a new discipline, and then another one that I added as a test. Where does this data come from? If you go up to your entities, go to discipline, you can see these are the ones that I've added here. So this is exactly what the JavaScript / Angular front end is doing, is just going off requesting these items. It's coming back as JSON, and then it's showing it here as a table. So now that we have that data in our iOS application, what we can do is now put it into a native form. So I'm going to create a variable here called response array. And this is going to be a array. It's going to be an NS array. I'm going to set that equal to the response result value, like we did in the previous one, and we're going to cast that out as, and unwrap this optionally null object as a NS array. Okay, and so again, it'll take this value, which comes back as any value, and make sure that it is a NS array. Now there's better ways of handling that, but we're not going to get into that in this video. And then we're going to loop through each one. So we're going to do a fast iteration loop or a for each loop, depending upon your background. So we're going to put this into an object just called object, and these are going to come from the response array. Okay, and then in curly braces, we're going to simply print out that object here. And then what I'm going to do is actually just get rid of these print statements just for clarity in our board here. Hit save, Control R. Actually, I'm just going to do the breakpoint here. Hit Control R, and that way we just skip through all that authentication stuff that we already know works. Okay, so now we have our response. We'll step over that. We've created this response array. The array now has 3 values in it, and in each value it has a dictionary corresponding to the JSON object that comes back. And so what we'd want to do is parse this into a Swift object, where a Swift class, for example, would have a method or a member called programs, ID, etc., and then make these Swift objects. What I'm going to simply do is just print those out to the screen. So we have our first object here, which is the new one, discipline 1, ID 3. Step over that one, print. Here's our next one with ID 1. and then print out the next one with ID 2. Now you might be asking, why are these IDs coming back as random, 312 instead of 123? Well, when you're grabbing stuff from the database, it's not guaranteed in which order they come back in. And if you do want to alter that, you actually have to either alter it on the back end. You can sort it on the front end, in this case mobile. Like once you get these back, you can have a sort function either in here that sorts it for you. But the most efficient way, if you're going to do this a lot, is not to put that work on the client, but to put that on the back end, again, if it's going to do that every time. Or add a parameter to your endpoint that says, hey, can you sort this for me, either by ID or by discipline name. So if you're interested in how to reorder this response that comes back from the server, what you can do is you can go to into your microservice that handles this REST API. And for this one, and let's look at where we will actually get all the disciplines. And so these are puts, and then this is a get. So get disciplines is the one that we're using. And this is the mapping here. So API/disciplines. API, by the way, if you're not familiar with how this is laid out, there's a request mapping for this entire class. So everything starts with /API. And then go back to the get/disciplines. It's going to return a list of type discipline DTOs, which you can investigate in the DTO listings. You can go ahead and look at what that object looks like. And then this is the method called getAllDisciplines, and it's going to return a discipline service find all. And so if we hold down the command key and click into this, it'll show us in the discipline service where this is defined. Now, this is just an interface, and the interface is actually implemented. Okay, so this find all, this interface is going to be implemented in the discipline service implementation. So to find that, we hit Command O, and it'll open up this little document. And because we've highlighted that, it'll give us some examples. And this is, again, the implementation that we want for this interface. So if we go ahead and click on that, and then search down until you find the find all method that we were talking about implementing. And it's going to call this and then return the result of this query on the database. And so what we're actually interested in is this find all with eager relationships. And so if you command click into that, it'll show you the discipline repository. You can see that we have these queries set up. So for this query, it's saying select discipline from the discipline table, and then it's doing a join from the discipline programs. Now, disciplines, if you remember from our previous videos, disciplines have programs. And so for the mobile application developer discipline, we might have programs like iOS development or Android development, etc. So that's just what that's doing, is just pulling out the next level because of how we define our relationships. Again, those are in previous videos. So then after the join fetch, we're going to do a order by, and the order by is going to be the discipline.id, and we're going to tell that to ascend because we want the IDs to ascend or increase from there. So let's go ahead and save that, restart our server, and once that's done, we're going to switch back to Xcode, and when that, we're going to run our iOS application and see what we get. Okay, so once again, this is going to order by and then discipline.id, and again, we're going to ascend, have those values ascending, so 1, 2, 3, as opposed to descending, which would be the keyword DSC, and that would go 3, 2, 1 in our case. And then we're going to save that, restart our server. We're going to go back to Xcode, wait for that to restart. And once that's restarted, we're going to hit Command R to run our application, switch over to our simulator. Okay, our simulator's loaded. It's hit our breakpoint. And then what we're going to do is we see that the result is a success. Step over that code. Now we have the response array, and we're just going to simply step through this for loop and see that it indeed is ID 1, ID 2, and ID 3. So in this tutorial, what we did is we went into Swagger and we looked at the different resources that we have, namely in this case, discipline, and we got the results from it and we parsed it, we looked at it, and then we realized that the data that was coming back wasn't quite satisfactory for our needs. So we went over to our application, we found the discipline repository where this query is actually made, and we wrote some MySQL query, which is what we set up for our application, and we just added in this order by discipline.id ascending. And again, if you wanted to have that order by something else, such as discipline price, for example, or discipline name, we would replace that .id with discipline name, ascending or descending. If you want it in alphabetical order, it's ascending because A is less than Z, and just in case you're curious about that. Restarted this application, went back to our Xcode implementation, launched our iOS code, and we saw that we're getting the data back here. So my plan for this series is going to then do an Android version of this in my next video, and then after that we're going to touch upon different aspects of JHipster that you guys care about. So if you are interested in learning anything particular about the JHipster stack, do let me know in the comments below. So I do plan on doing more JHipster videos in the near future. You may see some videos here and there on other topics, but I do want to definitely take this to the next level and show you some of the really complicated things, and namely how to deploy this application out to a production server. And so do subscribe if you're interested in seeing that. Give this video a like if you want to see more of this type of video. And feel free to hit me up in the comments below or send me a message in the email that is in the About page for this channel's description. So thank you guys so very much. Your support has been awesome, and we'll continue this series in later videos. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.